You know, there comes a time when you realize you can only hold off a certain topic long enough before it comes back to bite you. Such facts are true in any era of life, and certainly when you overlook covering movies in your days trying to be a YouTuber. Because I have been very selective when it comes to talking about certain things or ideas unless I smush them together in different videos and sometimes separate topics of their own. Such topics include the period of Disney that was the most infuriating and devastating in their own modern era, just as they celebrated their 100th anniversary. Which of course leads to the disappointing answer of Strange World that most of the world forgot. The biggest Disney animated bomb since the likes of quite possibly The Black Cauldron, when the film made less money than its entire budget. To put that into perspective, films like Lightyear and Wish that also failed bigly made as much money as their reported budget cost, around $200 million for each film, which unfortunately didn't actually mean that made money if you knew how those budgets work. And with a budget of estimated up to $100 million and only grossing $73 million during its entire run, it managed to lose about $197 million according to sources, becoming one of the biggest box office bombs of all time. Truly remarkable for Disney, creating one of the worst failures to ever appear in the last 100 years that nobody even seeks to remember so often. Of course, unless you count how many people watch it on Disney Plus now, with each movie's drop that gets tons of views. Speaking about Disney Plus, of course, as another attributed reason to why it actually failed, when the company decided to plop their films on their service after COVID and create an expectation that most films would just end up being watchable on there. So nobody would even care to go and watch it in a theater, and they wouldn't even try to market to the people to try and watch it, or just even failed to satisfy the people who did watch it in the theaters, thus creating this negative attention where they probably never even cared to promote it to get it to that audience. A time where Disney was being heavily criticized outside politically and culturally for its stances and trying to make an effort to promote its first openly LGBT characters, when you look at how Lightyear and this movie were released in the same year and both failed to make any money. A reaction that the media certainly covered to some extent of why they failed, leading to not even being released in countries and regions that don't even tolerate that. And while that reaction is clear and evident for the time and especially today, I don't want to focus on that as the main factor. Sure, we can discuss this part as some of it of why people revolted and didn't want to see that, but that's still not the reason why this movie couldn't work either. The factors that actually pertain to the overall story itself that failed to entertain. Because I honestly could care less about the relationships of certain characters and individuals when I couldn't even bother to care about them individually. I just wanted to focus on where the story is and the heroes are leading to, and Strange World compared to even earlier Disney films just didn't satisfy that. So in regards to these talking points, this video will just focus on the case of the most uninteresting area that Disney could ever find itself in. A challenge for a time that I could remember ignited arguments of other studios and animation succeeding when Disney could not, and failing to remember what it once was. And some of you might have remembered that time when I covered films like Puss in Boots that everyone took to heart and created memes alongside Strange World as the poster child that Disney was doing worse than their rival studios. But of course that wasn't the case, because the other studios would have its ups and downs too, as we have seen. But this film is not the worst thing that Disney has ever created, just so we can make that clear. It's far from it, where there are so many other infuriating Disney movies, like Wish, but just how this one was never able to get itself off the ground. Never felt like a proper Disney adventure that makes you feel the message and themes of the world at play, only in certain moments, but never enough to justify its own weight. So without further ado, it's time to look at the strange failure of Strange World and why it didn't work. But actually, before we begin at the start of the film, I just want to mention a bit of the design. One of the greater attributes of Strange World is the inspiration from these pulp comics or magazines of the earlier 20th century, named for the wood pulp paper that they were printed on that was cheap at the time. The style itself was pretty unique and quite likable, when they also took aim from adventure stories mostly based off of Jules Verne. Such ideas are great recipes for a great film when you have this adventure type story that was last sort of seen since Atlantis. However, when it comes to that and what you will see in this video as I'll explain, you will understand that Atlantis is the much better film to watch rather than this, because it fails to satisfy both the adventure and the family story it will go for. In the beginning events of the film, we learn of this place called Avalonia that is surrounded by these vast tall mountains. The people live modestly in their sheltered civilization, where the question of the future was always present in their minds, exploring what is on the other side of such mountains, including the likes of the brave adventurers known as the Clades, consisting of father-son duo Jaeger and Searcher Clade. What's interesting about this is that they really do dive into the comic style to serve as an introduction to our main characters, charting the vast unknown terrain to reach impossible goals. And then when we find ourselves to a certain part of their journey in the mountains is where we find that Searcher makes this interesting discovery of a green plant that will become known as Pando, giving off strange energy that affects certain things around them. enough to the point where young Searcher, apparently voiced at this point in his life as a young teen by an over 40-year-old Jake Gyllenhaal, tells his father about this new discovery that can benefit Avalonia. But Jaeger, being the adventurer that he is, dismisses that idea, wanting to continue the mission of What's Beyond the Mountains, where we first officially separate the ideas of the films within this family relationship. The specific personality of one generation to the next thinking that this is a good thing while the other thinks the opposite is. The extension of what we will know this film having in this transgenerational drama between father and son and grandson that is supposed to fill the movie with emotion but actually doesn't. And what I mean by this has to do with what happens next in this scene when he decides to take off for himself to continue with the journey, and then giving everyone a pass to go back home to Avalonia, leaving his son for good as we skip 25 years later to when society has rapidly evolved thanks to the introduction of Pando as an important fuel and energy source, allowing this technology that they have to the current age to exist. And what this does is to establish another huge theme that will come to play within the film, in terms of looking inward rather than outward of what you have in your life or what will be seen later down the road. For now, we see a grown-up Searcher living his life with his wife Meridian and his son Ethan, who's not really into the farming business that Searcher has built up and made a name for himself with. Instead, when we go to meet with his friends and his crush Diazo, his real dreams are to be an explorer like his grandfather Jaeger, whom he had never met, yet cannot because of the pressures of his father, who doesn't want the same fate to happen with him when he basically left him, becoming in a way overprotective and strict when it comes to what he wants in his life rather than Ethan having his own. So you get this picture of this cycle happening throughout this family in its main focus, going from adventurer to farmer to training farmer who wants to be an adventurer, to create some sort of tension for the plot going forward, but not what I think to be a good way to do so, especially coming off of a film like Encanto just released in the year prior, because in my opinion, sometimes this film likes to explain or show a little too much in terms of what it's thinking or focusing on when it's got other elements at play, like scenes involving Searcher's nightmare imagination of Ethan turning into his own father, like that's the path he's going to follow. Yes, sure, it's admirable that he wants to do the best for his own son rather than the pain his father straight up abandoning him, but the situation in comparison to what already has come out seems a little dull for me, that I just can't find myself to really caring that much, which I'm sure plenty of you might disagree with, and that's fine. I can see that being alright in a way that it is too, but not really compelling enough for the movies of this type, and more as we continue to tread along when we get the call to action. A moment that comes after the Clades were strangely enough dancing to Caravan Palace by the arrival of the president of Avalonia, Callisto Maul, who served on the expeditions with the Clades as we saw in the beginning, who comes at an urgent time when Pando is discovered to be losing its power, which causes a great risk for all of Avalonia, losing all of its progress over the last 2 decades with the power that they now have. And Ethan wants to go, but Searcher wants him to stay, not wanting to risk his own life and keep him safe while he goes to a place he'd never thought he'd see again after all that time, yet never stops Ethan because he snuck aboard the ship to continue with the journey, and Mom chasing after them as a result, when they get caught around strange creatures who attack the vessel, causing chaos before landing in the world below. A world that none of them have ever seen before, filled with other various blob-like creatures and uneven terrain that extends for miles, lost in confusion as Searcher gets separated from the rest of the crew, only for him to meet up with a larger bearded figure that ends up being his own lost father, who has been trapped in this strange world for the past 25 years apparently, almost losing his mind before Searcher gets him up and discusses what has been happening in the present day events, but still dug into his own convictions as the conflict of each generation continues, still persistent in finding what is beyond the mountains and latching on to the opportunity of boarding their own ship across the acidic oceans, while Ethan on the other hand sneaks away from the rest of the crew to attempt to find his father and manages to befriend a blue squishy creature he names Splat, who obviously is supposed to be the cutest character other than the Clades dog legend, and help them explore what this part of the world is even about, and even discover how harmful Pando is to these creatures as it injures it until Ethan tries to patch him up, showing us that there is an underlying problem with this plant of native life rather than Avalonia. All the while we're still dealing with both Searcher and Jaeger complaining to each other about their own lifestyle choices, arguing about statue sizes, discoveries that made their home a utopia, or the so-called humble farmer. Again, you see me here complaining about this relationship message because it just doesn't feel solid in comparison to most other Disney stories that have impactful dynamics between their families. It's not bad that they're trying to raise issue between between what if you were the son of a great explorer that could be hailed as a hero and trying to do better for your offspring, but the world doesn't lend itself too much credit in being compelling or intriguing for most audiences or the story that they're trying to go for this type. The bickering seems just too pointless when you realize that this is a part of a terrible era of Disney films that decided not to have classical villains after the end of their previous twist era. The only thing that's antagonistic is the forces that surround them when they go rescue Ethan and Splat to reunite with the rest of the crew. And of course, they just don't have anything much to say other than to attack the main invading source. This is key into bringing up because they really didn't market this movie well enough, causing questions of what you are trying to focus on. Well, you would say it would be clearly the family relationship since they focus on that side of life, but also seeing this other subplot with the creatures that inhabit this realm, and neither one is apparently strong enough to satisfy a single answer. Because there's nothing but bickering on their end even while they make it back to the ship, and we are already halfway into the film itself. I just don't feel good enough to care about this because of the comedic nature between these two and the constant chase sequences that doesn't tell me any reason to why we are here. Yes, we are here to save Pando, but that's it. This whole section is just dedicated to doing that, continuing Searcher's own fears with his father's reputation and teaching him the dangerous ways of adventuring, enough to the point that Ethan tries to introduce both of them to this game called Primal Outpost, in order for them to attempt to even work together. But even that doesn't work with Searcher's own love of Pando and Jaeger's love of exploring and conquering the unknown, things that contradict this apparent game's goal of trying to actually live harmoniously with your environment rather than killing or removing any of it, enough to the point that makes me angry as Ethan for the opposite reason as he describes soon after I played this damn clip.
What kind of game has no bad guys?
That's just poor storytelling.
So, in this short scene, we get a great picture of what kind of movie this is all about. That seems more like a thinly veiled attack on this type of story that doesn't have any bad guys like the game itself, with Jaeger pointing out that it's poor storytelling for not even having bad guys that Ethan gets frustrated calling his own father and grandfather bad for annoying him, not even listening to the game's message. Like, if you want to know the reason why I particularly do not like this movie, it's because of scenes like this that seemingly poke fun of the fact that it doesn't have villains at all, with the elders of the family stating what most of us would rather believe since it goes in that direction rather than its main focus. Which is just so ironic in talking about when you understand that having a real bad guy involved rather than the creatures itself would inherently be 10 times better than the final product of this very film. Because with Primal Outpost, we know and understand the other big message that this film was hinting at with Pando and what is discovered after they cross the acidic ocean, as an environmental concern that negatively affects most of life. You'll see this part in a moment when the truth about the plant is revealed, but taking a step back to explain the problems with this entire narrative. Sure, it's fine if you want to have a family conflict with certain ideals, but it's not being built off well to supplement or satisfy this major environmental plot playing into the background, which villains could have a better sway in navigating towards the truth. Again, it doesn't help when Encanto was the bigger story that made it a focus on the family, the problem between the expectations of earlier generations and helping each other out under their own surface pressures. A movie that already has that element as a key when you go from the first generation to the third, and it doesn't need to be held in the background of another subplot. Where stories like Strange World is actually more into comparison to its obvious box office bomb predecessors we know today in Atlantis and Treasure Planet. Of course, those films aren't like bombs to the level of Strange World and did make way more money than this ever did, but they did still end up not making money at all. However, at the cost of becoming beloved cult classics that many Disney and animated fans love to this day. So in terms of the worlds that they go into, and of course the box office performance, most of these films are very similar to a certain degree, which hopefully these failures doesn't stop them from still making these kinds of specific films because they are still good for the most part. But the main reason to bring this up is because of how these films worked with their heroes and villains. Mostly I'm going to mention Atlantis in this case because it has the most similar base of the story adventure, yet how they both still focus on their main protagonists, either Milo Thatch or Jim Hawkins, adventuring forth into the unknown, searching for something they want or need that helps their own lives, like Searcher, Ethan, and Jaeger in Strange World. But it's just one person that is also paired with the secret villain who reveals himself later to be more for himself, or of course redeemed and actually good in the case of John Silver, or just literally uncaring profiteer mercenary in the case of Commander Rourke. More specifically, we are taking a look at the case of Atlantis, when we look at characters valuing this lost world and this civilization of people who disappeared after the mistakes of their own past, where a character like Milo wants to preserve that. However, in the case of Rourke, he simply does not care. being a pragmatist who values the resources of greed rather than its humanitarian or environmental concern, for the culture of a lost people and his own crew. He enters this story as a commanding, respectable figure of authority, then over time reveals himself to be a manipulative brute. The type of character and type of story that fits quite well and would serve something like Strange World to a greater degree, with its apparent focus on Pando as a resource like fossil fuels and the greater consequence of having such figures go head to head with their own heroes, instead of delegating a family dealing with their own individual definitions that are well-meaning since they are good characters who actually love each other and find out to respect their wishes. So although it's not bad that they thought such ideas would be great in this setting, and I don't hate the characters for the way that they are, these previous films prove that it's more effective if one singular message drives the story, separating family and their environment. And if they tried to create a movie around one singular idea, then I could probably see the marketing and general reaction to be much better and overall clearer, which as a result would be more effective, completely separating Encanto as the family-focused story and then Strange World as the environmental focus. But going back to the plot and continuing along with our adventure, we get to the apparent heart of Pando that has become much stronger than they ever expected. The opposite effect of the plants getting weaker on the surface because they now thought it is to be defending itself against all of the wildlife attacking it. But through the warnings of Splat and the truth of Ethan not wanting to be like his father, which he sits back to apologize with, we get this shocking actual truth when we reach the other side of the mountains that they all have been living on this big, gigantic living creature, showing us that the entire Strange World beneath them, with all of the squishy creatures, are actually part of its immune system and intestines that make up its body when they reach its bigger eye. That after all this time, Pando is discovered to be a disease attacking this creature, and the smaller immune system is just trying to destroy it like any sick person's body would normally do, but can't because humans of this world have been thriving off of it as an energy source, as that allegory to natural resources affecting the environment, where although it's built as surprising, it's mainly lackluster when you involve those elements and what I just brought up in the other stories earlier. It's just not as effective as it should be because we've been too busy focusing on this family dynamic, and now we're thrusted into the real world of an actual creature. And when they try to reveal this truth, Jaeger storms off the other way to get to the truth he's been searching for his entire life, while Callisto, hardly believing what they said, decides to continue with the mission and lock them up. But this doesn't work when they escape seconds later in the most pointless lockup scene in existence that doesn't prove any belief that they held when they continue with it seconds later. Like, you have these hints of conflict separating itself out with these individuals not believing what they say or believing in a certain direction, but then they decide to regress these characters back to help them, like Jaeger going with his son and Ethan with Splat, and then Callisto helping out with Meridian on the ship. And this is just so frustrating because it's just so easy for them to deal with the real problems after showing the root cause. Like, now, because the issue is fully revealed, we can all get aboard just like that because it's very necessary to do so. And just like a snap of the fingers, they all come together to destroy it with ease and help the immune system finally battle what's been harming this creature and Avalonia to that extent. And after they all succeed, the heart finally gets restored and the rest of the body functions as normally with this creature, meaning mission accomplished, and the entire family is united once again, face to face with the gratitude of this big giant. The creation of a beautiful paradise unified once again for the mission of where do we go next. This is where we find out a year later, all of them are living much more happier than ever before. All relationships are healed, with Ethan going off with his friends and beginning his own relationship with Diazo, while Jaeger connects with his ex-wife, or former widow in this case, and then helps out Searcher with his new food-based farm. And how Avalonia finally uses renewable resources like the Venture ship turning into a wind turbine to show a brighter future rather than the harmful past that most people didn't know happened under their own feet. Just like how we are pulling back to reveal that this big creature everyone has been living off of is in fact a gigantic turtle, which is based obviously upon various mythologies that speak of a world-based or cosmic turtle holding it on its back, or in this sense just traversing this relatively water-based planet. So in the end, Strange World is a movie that is both a family drama and an environmental message, with both hardly even working to be as well as to be expected. One that doesn't mean it was a bad idea to do that by any means, but evident by their own lack of proper promotion of what movie this was alongside other audiences that that vehemently disagreed with the company's own political stances at the time or even now with the other movie choices, but one that clearly shows that this wasn't the biggest issue with this film, written with the many expectations that this company has been doing in building in terms of appeasing without writing something good as a result, where you shouldn't actually care about the messages if you actually enjoyed the movie overall, but how that never came to be with the case of an unremarkable plot and a group of characters that clash together, that it should be more directed to the directionless nature of combining elements together that would have otherwise worked with its interesting animation and design background of the world of pulp comics, where regardless if you can find the themes to be well-meaning or not for others, you can't give the movie a good mark for its sloppy aim, because if you do like this film, there is certainly proof that validates that in terms of its messages, but still how the general public could not find it being very compelling, that because of a lack of cohesive interest, it becomes pretty dull and not enjoyable to any amount of degree that should have been expected. And as we have learned in these recent times, in the ups and downs of Disney, no film should be guaranteed for success, including in the wobbly run this studio has had for 100 years, where the ones that do succeed on the pulse of having a good idea of what it wants with full confidence, and for the ones that do fail, are just scapegoated for its failures of not delivering full intent, where everyone just decides to skip that one out. That the lesson here shouldn't be that this film was awful, actually not with just an awful performance, but for the legacy of mismanaged companies that forgets the craft it created, to finally have a group of people that can take their time, which is all we can ask for, in it working itself out again. And one day it shall do that. One day, that is. Goodbye.